Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Frank Rose. Frank is above all a storyteller. He's a former contributing editor at Wire magazine and contributing writer at Fortune magazine. He teaches global business executive about storytelling, of course, at Concordia, at Concordia is where I went to school, at Columbia University. He is the author of 4 books, and his latest one is The Sea We Swim In, How Stories Work in a Data-Driven World. Frank, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alain. It's great to be here.
So, of course, all our audience are expecting a great story. So why don't we start with how did you get into this world? You were telling in the book that you wanted to be in the producing side of the stories as opposed to the receiving end. So can you take us back to those early days in your childhood that you were fascinated by stories?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. I grew up in Virginia, in the country, outside a small city, and the city was in a valley, and we were up in the hills. And I was an only child, so it's perhaps a little bit strange. And I used to, when I was a kid, I used to stand on the front lawn sometimes and look down at the city below, and you could see all these lights and so forth. It was too far away to make anything out, but it was just a beautiful tableau of lights. And I remember thinking very, very strongly, I remember, almost feeling the radio waves, sort of whizzing past me because, there were a couple of television stations and several radio stations, and this was in the late 60s, or maybe even earlier. And I was, very aware of this. And I thought at the time that I wanted to be where the signals were coming from, not where the signals were going to. And of course, it's all, everything has changed since then. And the signals are everywhere and anybody can generate them. But at the time, it was very, very different. So I did the only thing I could think of to do to get started, which was to volunteer for the school newspaper.
Okay, so you volunteer for the school newspaper. You evidently wrote a few stories. And then what? What did you study?
I studied journalism. I went to Washington and Lee, which is a small private school in Virginia, where they have a journalism major. So I took that. Much of being a journalist, however, is learning about other things. So I took a lot of courses in sociology and politics and history and things like that I was just really interested in. And when I graduated, I came to New York shortly after that. And before long, I started writing for the Village Voice. And I was writing for the Voice, which is a sort of weekly alternative newspaper, mainly about music. And that happened to be a very fortuitous moment because it was when the whole punk scene at CBGB was beginning. And it was a kind of a very dynamic moment in the New York music scene. So for me, that was great fun.
Okay, so we know that storytelling has been part of of us as human beings. It's what makes us different. But is journalism is going to die? I mean, we are being taken over by artificial intelligence, by all these kind of robots, and social media is eroding the career of journalism. What's your view in regards to the future of journalism?
Interesting question, and it's complicated. There's definitely a sense in which newspapers are being undermined, most of them, by both are abandoned by both their readers and their advertisers. There are certainly a few exceptions. They tend to be the very big international papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. And these papers are very deliberately cultivating an audience outside their home cities and, on the west coast of the US and in Canada and in Europe and elsewhere. So It's not that journalism is dead or dying, but it's certainly changing, and it's changing also in regard to magazines and online publications, which are often. I'm thinking of Vox and The Verve and so forth. They're often sort of a hybrid of what magazines used to be, and to a certain extent still are, and what newspapers used to be, and to a certain extent still are. And they're interesting and fairly unique formats, journalism formats for each of those media. And part of what's happened is that we're increasingly moving from what's called the inverted pyramid in journalism school, where you get the most important facts in the first paragraph or two, and then it gets less important and less interesting sometimes as you move down. We're moving from that to more of a feature format. But what's really interesting and relevant here, I think, is that everybody is becoming a storyteller these days. Everybody is a storyteller. And to a certain extent, that was always true, but we didn't recognize it, because in the schema of the 20th century, we were, really talking about professional media. You had professional writers, professional reporters, such as myself, and all of that sort of thing. But now with social media and, also just the change in ethos, the change in expectations, it's becoming clear that everybody is a storyteller and everybody should be a storyteller. And that's really what I focus on in both the Columbia program and in the new book.
Okay, and before we get to the new book, can you just tell us quickly the titles of your previous books as well?
Sure. The one before this was called The Art of Immersion, how digital technology is changing Wall Street, Madison Avenue, Hollywood, and the way we tell stories. And that was a sort of outgrowth, really, of the 10 years that I spent at Wired magazine. When I was at Wired, I was reporting about things at the intersection of media and technology, which could be literally anywhere from Hollywood to cell phones. And, excuse me, and what I realized at a certain point during that period was that the way people were telling stories was changing, the forms. And I didn't quite understand it. In fact, I didn't understand it at all at first, but I could definitely sense it. And that's why I started to write that book. I left the magazine. I'd been there for 10 years. It was time to move on in any case. I left the magazine and started exploring this idea. And the result was The Art of Immersion, which along the way, what I realized was that every time there's a major new communications medium that comes along, it takes people 20 or 30 or 40 years to figure out what to do with it, to develop a form of storytelling that's native to that medium. And maybe the best and most obvious example might be motion pictures. The motion picture camera was invented around 1890, and it was 1915, 16 before we regularly had feature-length films that used all of what are now we take for granted as the grammar of cinema. I'm talking about things like cuts and pans and fades, because until you had a camera, there was no way to even imagine such a thing. And then it was another 10 years or so before you had sound. So, by the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, you had movies as we know them today. But before that, it was, very different. The first films were, 5 or 10 minutes long. So that was a key realization for me, and something that really informed the book. And I, realized that what was happening is we're, of course, in the middle of a major new shift now in terms of communications technology. And it keeps changing because new things being invented. When I wrote this book, virtual reality was not, really even on the horizon, but only a couple of years later, it very much was. So, this new book is, in a sense, it's a way to take stock of where we've gone in the last 10 years, and also it looks at stories as a medium of communication and as a form of persuasion, as a tool of persuasion. Other books I did, were more focused on individual stories. I did a book called The Agency, William Morris and the Hidden History of Show Business. That was published in 1995. And that was essentially a biography of this talent agency, at one time the leading agency in Hollywood, that had been started in 1898 as a vaudeville booking agency by a guy named William Morris. And it, ultimately became a sort of a saga, a family saga of loyalty and betrayal. And that's what I wanted to capture in that book, along with the idea of how the business works, because agents are they're sort of the grease that makes everything happen. And before that, I did a book called West of Eden, The End of Innocence at Apple Computer, which was really about the cult of Macintosh and about Steve Jobs and John Sculley. Jobs, of course, famously brought Sculley in from Pepsi to be the CEO of Apple, the company he had co-founded. And 3 years later, Sculley kicked him out of the company. So what was that about? So that's what I was doing there.
Okay, well, in this new book, we believe that we are rational beings and that we use logic to make our everyday decisions. But you claim that we use story to make sense of the world around us. So can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. This idea of the rational actor, it's a kind of a fundamental idea in economics as it's usually been taught. The idea that we will, look at what the opportunities are and make a rational decision about, our own self-interest and what the benefit would be. That's obviously not the case, as anybody who thinks about it for more than 30 seconds would realize. The thing about stories is they tap into another side of the brain, which is the emotional side. And another thing about stories is that they were not deemed worthy of study by psychologists and cognitive scientists until sometime in the 90s. They were considered, sort of frivolous. They were entertainment. They were sort of, fun, cheap, trashy things to do, but they weren't worthy of the time of actual scientists. And it was really Jerome Bruner, who was one of the most important and influential figures in psychology in the 20th century. He was one of the founders of cognitive science. He was one of the people who led the charge against behaviorism in the 1950s. And in the mid 80s, he started talking about stories and writing about stories and talking about them in the sense of, this is a whole other mode of thought that's very different from the rational mode that we're used to thinking about and used to studying and used to focusing on. It's a whole other mode of thought. It's the way that we form our concept of reality, and it's really important. And that was very slow to be adopted at first, that attitude, but within 15 years or so, it became very common. We sort of, I think, recognize now implicitly that we all experience our lives as a form of story, and much of what we're doing in our lives mentally is trying to make sense of that story, trying to figure out, what that story actually is. So there's a lot of there's a lot of post hoc thinking that goes into this. Like after the fact, we're able to draw the lines that make sense of our lives. When in fact, it's a lot of it is kind of random.
This brings to my mind a case story that I read where the Brazilian government was trying to bring awareness about AIDS in Brazil in general, and they bought all these advertisements showing scientific data of why people should use condoms and this and that, and no one listened to that. But then the government created a soap opera, a telenovela, about the dangers of not using condoms, for example. And then this telenovela had a huge audience and the message was received, but it was received in the capsule of a story, not on scientific data, not on statistics, none of that. It's just you wrap your message around a story and then people will digest it and take it and assume it into their life.
Yes, absolutely. I'm not familiar with that, but I'm going to explore that. I'm not surprised. It's a great story in itself, but it certainly illustrates what's going on here. I think, statistics in particular are notoriously ineffective at moving us to do something. We're just not hardwired to think in terms of statistics. We think we are, we hear a big number and it sounds really impressive, but more often than not, it's not going to make any impression or any difference in our actual behavior. Whereas something that we can identify with, some story that we can, project ourselves into is very different. And that's one of the key things that's come out in cognitive science in the last 15 or 20 years, is that we seem to understand stories, we seem to process them by imaginatively projecting ourselves into them. And that makes it personal, that brings it home in a way that a statistic will never do.
You also claim in your book that storytelling is a collaborative, a collaboration between the storyteller and the listener. So the storyteller kind of create the story, and then the listeners interpret it as his finished story, in other words.
Right. Yes, that's, I think, another very important fact. And it runs counter to everything that was assumed about stories and storytelling and writing and journalism and entertainment and advertising throughout the 20th century. It was sort of assumed that we were, well, there's a psychologist from Harvard Business School who describes this as the input-output engineering model. We just sort of assumed that you would have some input in the form of informing people about, say, the benefits of some product that you want to sell them, and that would generate output in the form of people going out and actually buying the product. It's sort of ridiculous. It's not how people think or operate at all. What we do is we sort of co-create a story, any kind of story, in partnership with the author. And whether we're thinking about it that way or not, that's really what we're doing. It makes it a very powerful thing, but it is completely different from the idea that we are, that we simply consume a story, which was, as I say, that idea was really prevalent throughout the 20th century. It shaped the advertising and entertainment and journalism businesses, all three. We were supposed to just sit back and be entertained or informed or sold to or whatever. And it's just not the way it works. And that's another reason that stories are so powerful and stories are so persuasive, because we actually have a mental investment in them.
Right. I have a theory and I wonder what's your feedback on this theory. So today we have all kind of billionaires that we admire because of whatever the business savviness of their and of their creations. But my theory is that half of their billions come not from their creation, but from the storytelling abilities. For example, there is no better person to present a product than Steve Jobs and Elon Musk. You know, he was broke 3 or 4 times, and then he convinced investors to give him even more money so that he can create these rockets that were going to Mars. We got Jeff Bezos, who didn't make any money for 10 years and he still asking for. And then on the bad side, we have Elizabeth Holmes from Terranos, who without any back in science, she got all these investors to give her billions of dollars. We got Bernie Madoff, who convinced smart people, smart business people to give him money because he had a story to tell. And although I don't agree with his political view, we got Donald Trump that also is always creating a narrative about his ideologies and people believe it.
Yes, absolutely. And these are all four, very powerful, very germane examples of how stories work. In the investment community, there's a term called story stocks. Story stocks are stocks that are primarily powered by the story of the founder or the CEO spins. And Theranos is a perfect example of that. It just happened that the story wasn't true and it was all, bull. And Donald Trump is a perfect example too. And especially when you compare him, with his opponent. I mean, whichever one of them you agree with politically, I think you would have to admit that Hillary did not really have a very good narrative. She did not have any clear sense of why she should be elected president. There's actually, I read somewhere that within her campaign, they couldn't think of a reason either, and that what they finally settled on was because it's her turn, and which is not that powerful a case to make, and whereas Trump spun this, to my mind, total fantasy that millions of people bought into, and was very, very effective at communicating that. And that, I think, points to another really key fact about storytelling and how it works, which is, it's not just one story that you tell. That's never the case. It's always everything that you do and everything that you tell, that becomes part of your story. And that's what, Trump was brilliant at. He did not confuse the issue. He was very clear and very straightforward about what he thought was right and wrong, and obviously millions of people bought into that, and it was. I think it was pretty clear from the start that it was going to be a disaster, but nonetheless, that's not what makes most people. Nonetheless, that's not how most people work.
Okay, well, my last question is, you make a claim that there is nothing less innocent than a story. So can you explain? I mean, we think of storytelling as something innocent, something that we practice with children or something that we do at a bar or a restaurant, but you have a different view about it.
Right. Yeah, that line is actually one I borrowed from a narratologist who is, I think, originally from the Netherlands and is now at the University Sydney, and his name is Tom Van Laer. And the point is that stories are persuasive. Stories are the most effective way of persuading people, and we see this again and again. And it ties in with what you were saying earlier about statistics don't seem to matter, and they, for the most part, they really don't. But stories can be told, can be spun in such a way that we are really we're sucked in by them. If you make an argument about something, our response is almost invariably going to be sort of, oh yeah, is that really true? Whereas stories famously induce a willing suspension of disbelief. And there was a very early a very early cognitive psychology study that was done at Ohio State by a woman named Melanie Green. And she was trying to figure out if people were, if their attitudes would be changed if they were more or less immersed in a story. If they were more immersed in a story, would they be more likely to change an attitude based on something the story is about? And she also, at the same time, wanted to find out if people were told the story was true or false, would that affect any change in their attitudes? I won't go into the whole thing, it's rather a long story, but the relevant part is that she found that if people were more immersed in the story, based on, like, did they care about the characters? Did they visualize the characters that they read about in their heads and that sort of thing? Then yes, they were more likely to have a change in attitudes. Whereas if they were told the story was true or false, and some people read the story, it was formatted like a newspaper article, and some people read the exact same story formatted like a short story in a fiction magazine. And that was found to have no effect at all. None.
Okay, well, I have shared this with my audience many times, but I'll tell you, I used to be a homophobic when I was a young man. And of course, many people told me, oh, that's wrong, blah, 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 and, I was still a homophobic. But then I started reading literature, and through literature, which I knew it was just the imagination of an author, it brought me empathy, and I just realized that, the how wrong I was. And then that changed my whole perspective, not to reasoning, not to statistics, but to storytelling. And yeah, that I know that comes from someone's imagination, but it worked for me.
Yes, right, exactly. I'm not surprised. I think that was a big factor in not literature necessarily, but the power of stories was a big factor in the acceptance of gay marriage here in the States. And because, and it was an ironic outgrowth ultimately of the AIDS crisis, because so many people had to come out because they had no choice, because they were dying. And, suddenly it went from something, being gay, that is, went from something that, you didn't know anybody who was, to you realized that you knew lots of people who were, almost all of us, and they were all around us. And in some cases they were us. And, that changed our attitudes entirely. Empathy, of course, is an emotion, and that's just one of many emotions that stories can elucidate. But it's a perfect example of how stories work, I think.
Well, Frank, I feel like I'm abusing your time. You only promised me half an hour, but I just have one more question. Assuming, if you could share a tip for our listeners, how they can themselves become better storytellers.
Right. No, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I think there are several things that you can do, and my book is in the Sea We Swim In is in 3 parts, and part 2, which is the majority of the book, is really a step-by-step look at exactly this. But, and I'm not going to go into all the steps, but one of the key things is to keep your audience in mind and to know as much about your audience as possible, because ultimately the story is not about you, it's about your audience. I mean, even if you're telling a story about yourself, it's the audience that has to, you know, be partner with you and co-create the story in their own heads as you're telling it. And so that is a really critical factor, I think. There are certainly other factors you need to, and this is especially true if it's a story that you're writing or, you know, a film that you're making or anything, but you need to have real characters. You need to have characters that people identify with and can identify with, because that's how, as I said earlier, that's how we process stories. We project ourselves imaginatively into them. And in order for that to work, there really has to be somebody in the story that we can identify with, that we would, you know, see ourselves in. And so that's a really important important thing too. Another is detail. How much detail do you provide? It totally depends on the situation. If you're making an elevator pitch, which is basically a story, you want to be able to do it in 30 seconds or so, so 60 seconds max. And so there's not a lot of room for detail, so you have to really hone it down. If you have a bit more leisure, then you can draw it out. You can create all sorts of nuance, and nuance and character is one of the things that is most compelling in a story, I think.
Thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. I wonder if you could tell us just one last time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do?
Thank you. You can follow me at frankrose.com and or on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @frankrose. There is the book is called The Sea We Swim In: How Stories Work in a Data-Driven World. And if you like that, you might want to check out The Art of Immersion as well, my previous book. The Sea We Swim In and The Art of Immersion can both be found at bookstores all over. They're available, of course, at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. They're also available on bookshop.com, which is a site that supports independent bookstores, and at Porchlight Books. So I think that, you know, I'm really glad to have an opportunity to talk about this. It's something that means a great deal to me and is obviously an outgrowth of, you know, basically my entire career. And I really thank you for the opportunity to go into it.
It's awesome. Thank you, Frank. Until next time.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.